In security architecture, monitoring is the part that turns your design from a collection of controls into a system you can actually trust over time, because trust requires evidence, not just intention. New learners often picture monitoring as a dashboard that someone checks occasionally, but real monitoring requirements are about what the environment must reliably observe, record, and surface when something changes in a risky way. If you cannot see authentication failures, privilege changes, suspicious data access, or unexpected network paths, you are forced to guess during incidents, and guessing is slow and expensive. Monitoring is also where many architectures silently fail because teams assume the logs will be there later, only to learn that they were never enabled, never retained, or never connected across systems. This episode focuses on how to specify monitoring requirements at the infrastructure and system level so detection and response are practical, timely, and consistent. The goal is to help you define what must be collected, how it must be protected, and how it must support decisions under stress, without turning the work into a list of tools or a pile of noisy data. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong monitoring requirement begins by stating what monitoring is supposed to accomplish in plain terms, because collection without purpose creates noise and missed signals. For detection, monitoring must reveal when a system behaves outside its expected pattern, especially in ways that could indicate compromise, misuse, or failure of critical controls. For response, monitoring must preserve enough context to answer urgent questions, such as who did what, from where, to which system, and with what outcome. That means requirements should emphasize both timeliness and completeness, since late or partial evidence can be as harmful as no evidence at all. Another beginner misunderstanding is assuming monitoring is purely a security team concern, when in reality it is a design dependency that operations, developers, and incident responders rely on. If architects do not specify monitoring expectations, teams tend to implement whatever is easiest, which often means fragmented logs and weak visibility across boundaries. A good requirement also acknowledges that monitoring must be sustainable, because systems that generate unusable volumes of events train teams to ignore alerts. The purpose, then, is not to collect everything, but to collect the right signals with enough fidelity to support confident action. To make monitoring requirements concrete, it helps to separate telemetry types into events, logs, metrics, and traces, because each answers different questions during detection and response. Events and logs provide discrete records of actions, such as a login attempt, a configuration change, or a permission denial, and they are essential for accountability and investigations. Metrics summarize system behavior over time, such as CPU usage, error rates, or request volumes, which helps detect anomalies like denial of service or runaway processes. Traces and similar request-level correlation data help you understand how a single transaction moved through multiple components, which is increasingly important in distributed systems where the attack path spans services. Beginners often focus only on logs, but a mature monitoring specification recognizes that a security incident often shows up first as a metric anomaly, then as log evidence, and finally as trace context that explains the path. Requirements should therefore state which telemetry types are required for which components, based on their role and risk. For example, authentication components need detailed event records, while gateways and load balancers may need both detailed logs and traffic metrics. By writing requirements that treat telemetry as multidimensional, you make it easier to detect both sharp attacks and slow-moving misuse. A core part of monitoring requirements is defining the security-relevant events that must be captured at trust boundaries, because boundaries are where untrusted interactions become internal actions. These requirements should cover authentication events, session establishment and termination, authorization decisions, and access to sensitive resources, since those are the places where identity and privilege are asserted. The requirement should make clear that both successful and failed attempts matter, because repeated failures can indicate probing and brute force efforts. while unusual successes can indicate stolen credentials. It should also require that events capture meaningful context, such as the authenticated identity, the target resource or action, the source location information available to the system, and the result of the decision. Another important requirement is consistency across entry points, meaning the same boundary enforcement should produce comparable logs whether requests arrive through different interfaces or services. Without that consistency, detection becomes unreliable because attackers can choose the path with weaker visibility. For response, boundary logs must be timely and centrally accessible because the first minutes of an incident often depend on seeing whether suspicious activity is ongoing. A boundary-focused requirement keeps monitoring aligned with architecture rather than scattering it randomly across components. Identity and privilege monitoring deserves special emphasis because many high-impact incidents begin with credentials, then escalate through privileges, and those stages are detectable if you require the right signals. Requirements should state that privileged role assignments, permission changes, group membership modifications, and administrative policy updates must be logged with strong context and protected from tampering. They should also specify that sensitive authentication events, such as repeated failures, unusual logins, or logins from unexpected patterns, must be detectable as anomalies rather than disappearing into a sea of routine noise. If you reference a Security Operations Center, SOC, in this context, the architecture requirement is not that a SOC must exist, but that there must be a defined capability to review identity and privilege signals and act on them quickly. A common misconception is that identity systems are inherently trustworthy, so their logs are optional, but identity systems are often the most valuable target an attacker can influence. Monitoring requirements should also include service identities, not only humans, because service-to-service trust is a frequent lateral movement path. When you can observe privilege transitions and unusual identity behavior, you can contain incidents earlier and reduce blast radius. Network and infrastructure monitoring requirements are often the difference between knowing an attacker is present and seeing only vague symptoms like slowness or errors. Requirements should define what network flows and boundary devices must report, such as connections to sensitive segments, unexpected outbound traffic, and changes in routing or access rules. They should also specify that key infrastructure systems, like load balancers, gateways, and named services, must log decisions that affect how traffic is routed and permitted, because attackers frequently target these control points. If you mention Intrusion Detection System, IDS, and Intrusion Prevention System, IPS, the requirement should focus on outcomes such as detecting suspicious patterns and alerting with context, rather than assuming a specific placement or brand. Another important requirement is that monitoring must support correlation, because a single network event may be benign, but a chain of related events can indicate compromise. Beginners sometimes think network monitoring is only for blocking attacks, but in architecture it is equally about providing evidence for response and ensuring segmentation is functioning as designed. If segmentation exists only on paper, network monitoring will reveal cross-zone traffic that should not occur. Network monitoring requirements therefore validate both security controls and the assumptions that controls rely on. Host and endpoint monitoring requirements are essential for detection and response because many attacks involve manipulating processes, persistence mechanisms, and local privilege on individual machines. Requirements should specify that critical hosts, such as administrative workstations, servers handling sensitive data, and systems that manage configuration, must generate reliable telemetry about process execution, privileged actions, and security-relevant system changes. If you reference endpoint detection and response, EDR, the architectural focus is that endpoints must provide visibility into suspicious activity and support investigation, not that a specific product must be deployed. Host monitoring should also include integrity signals where feasible, such as unexpected changes to critical binaries, services, or scheduled tasks, because those often indicate persistence. Another beginner misunderstanding is assuming that servers are stable and predictable, so monitoring them is less important than monitoring user devices, when in reality compromised servers can become long-lived footholds. Requirements should also address the privacy and data minimization aspect of endpoint telemetry, ensuring monitoring captures what is needed for security without collecting unnecessary sensitive user data. For response, endpoints must be able to support containment actions, such as isolating a host from the network under controlled conditions, but requirements should emphasize safe, targeted actions rather than disruptive blanket shutdowns. Host-level visibility is what turns an incident from a mystery into a manageable investigation. Application and service monitoring requirements are where many architectures struggle because applications generate complex behavior and many teams default to minimal logging that is useful only for debugging, not for security. Requirements should state that applications and services must log security-relevant actions such as access to sensitive functions, changes to critical configurations, administrative actions, and enforcement decisions like authorization denials. They should also require that logs avoid leaking sensitive data, because careless logging can turn monitoring into a data exposure problem, especially when logs are centralized. Another important requirement is to include correlation identifiers so that actions can be traced across services without relying on fragile guesses, which becomes essential when investigating distributed transactions. This is a place where beginners often underestimate how quickly a simple question becomes hard, such as which service actually approved a sensitive action and what other services were involved. Good monitoring requirements also define error handling visibility, requiring that failures are logged with enough context to support investigation without exposing internals to end users. For detection, applications should surface patterns like repeated authorization failures, unusual request volumes to specific endpoints, or attempts to access functions that a role should never use. When application telemetry is designed intentionally, it supports both security and reliability and becomes a shared asset rather than a specialized add-on. Log integrity, retention, and time synchronization requirements are foundational because monitoring is only as trustworthy as the evidence it preserves. Requirements should state that security-relevant logs must be protected from tampering, meaning that systems should not allow ordinary administrators of the application to silently delete or alter the logs that would reveal misuse. They should also define retention periods appropriate to the environment's risk, because investigations often begin days or weeks after the initial compromise, and short retention can erase the trail. Time accuracy is another non-negotiable requirement, because without consistent time, event correlation across systems becomes unreliable and response teams lose confidence in their conclusions. If you reference Network Time Protocol, NTP, the requirement is that systems must synchronize clocks to an authoritative time source so timestamps are consistent and auditable. Another key point is that retention must apply not only to raw logs, but also to the metadata needed to interpret them, such as mappings of user identifiers and system names. Beginners sometimes assume logs naturally persist and remain interpretable, but real environments often lose logs to storage limits, misconfiguration, or format changes. A well-written requirement makes log evidence durable and reliable, which is critical for both detection and response. Centralization and correlation requirements define how monitoring moves from isolated signals to an operational detection capability. A central repository allows cross-system correlation, consistent search, and consistent alerting, which is necessary when incidents span multiple components. If you mention a security information and event management (SIEM) capability, the requirement should focus on centralized ingestion, normalization, and correlation, rather than assuming a specific platform. Requirements should specify that logs from critical systems must be forwarded reliably, with detection for ingestion failure, because a silent break in log forwarding is itself a security risk. They should also address normalization, meaning key fields like identity, source, action, and result should be represented in a consistent way so correlation does not depend on manual translation. Correlation requirements should define expected linkages, such as tying an authentication event to subsequent privileged actions and sensitive data access, which supports rapid scoping of incidents. Another beginner misconception is treating centralization as purely a storage problem, but centralization is about making evidence usable under time pressure. When evidence is scattered, response becomes slow and politically contentious because teams cannot agree on what happened. Centralized monitoring requirements reduce that friction by creating a shared factual foundation. Alerting requirements are where monitoring becomes detection, and they must be written carefully to avoid two failure modes: too many alerts that get ignored, or too few alerts that miss real problems. Requirements should define what categories of events must generate alerts, such as suspected credential abuse, privilege escalation indicators, unexpected access to sensitive data, and signs of lateral movement across network zones. They should also define alert quality expectations, meaning alerts must include enough context for a responder to act, such as which system is involved, which identity is implicated, and what the observed behavior was. Another important requirement is severity and prioritization, where the alerting system should classify alerts based on potential impact and confidence, so responders can focus on the most urgent issues first. Beginners often assume alerting is simply turning on rules, but rule design is an architecture decision because it reflects what you consider abnormal and what outcomes you most need to prevent. Alerting should also include health alerts, such as when a monitoring agent stops reporting or when log ingestion drops, because losing visibility can be as dangerous as an active attack. Finally, requirements should define notification pathways and expected response times for high-severity alerts, because an alert that no one sees promptly is not a detection capability. Thoughtful alerting requirements keep monitoring actionable rather than overwhelming. Monitoring requirements should also address detection engineering and continuous improvement, because threat patterns and system behavior evolve, and static rule sets degrade over time. Requirements can specify that detection content must be reviewed and tuned periodically, especially after incidents, major deployments, or significant environment changes. This is not a tool-specific requirement. It is a lifecycle requirement that prevents detection from becoming stale. It also creates a feedback loop where new attack paths discovered through incidents or tabletop exercises result in new monitoring logic and better coverage. Another important requirement is documentation of detection logic assumptions, such as what is considered normal for a given service, because without those assumptions, tuning becomes arbitrary and political. Beginners sometimes think monitoring is a switch you flip, but in reality, monitoring is a system you maintain, like any other control. Requirements should also encourage testing of detections, meaning teams should validate that alerts trigger when expected and do not trigger for routine behavior, because untested detections create false confidence. When monitoring requirements include continuous improvement, they acknowledge that detection is part of operating a secure system, not a one-time configuration. This also supports regression thinking, because changes in systems and dependencies must not silently erase detection coverage. Response enablement requirements are what connect monitoring to real-world outcomes, because detecting an issue is only useful if the organization can act quickly and safely. Requirements should specify that monitoring outputs must support common response tasks, such as scoping which systems and accounts are affected, identifying the timeline of events, and determining whether sensitive data access occurred. They should also specify that logs must support containment decisions, such as whether an identity should be disabled, whether a host should be isolated, or whether a service boundary should be tightened, and those decisions require trustworthy evidence. Another requirement area is case management and handoff, meaning alerts and investigations should be trackable, with context preserved, so responders do not lose information during shift changes or escalation. Beginners often underestimate how quickly an incident becomes chaotic, and monitoring requirements that support structured response help reduce that chaos. Response enablement also includes ensuring responders can access logs even during partial outages, because incidents often degrade systems and hide evidence. Requirements should also define data access controls for monitoring data, since logs can contain sensitive information and should be protected while still being accessible to authorized responders. When monitoring is designed for response, it becomes a tool for calm decision-making rather than a noisy alarm system. Privacy and data minimization requirements for monitoring are essential because logs and telemetry can become a secondary data store filled with sensitive information, and that creates risk if mishandled. Requirements should state that monitoring should capture identifiers and context needed for security, but should avoid capturing sensitive content unnecessarily, such as full personal records or secrets. They should also require masking or redaction practices where appropriate, especially for fields that could expose credentials or sensitive values if logs are breached. Another important requirement is access control and auditing for the monitoring platform itself, because a monitoring repository is a high-value target for attackers who want to erase evidence or learn about the environment. Monitoring requirements should therefore include strong authentication for monitoring access, least privilege roles, and audit logging of who searched for what. Beginners sometimes assume monitoring is always good and more is always better, but indiscriminate collection can violate privacy expectations and create new attack surface. Clear requirements help strike the balance between having enough evidence and not collecting unnecessary sensitive data. They also help teams avoid accidental leaks, such as logging raw request payloads that include personal data, which can turn detection into a compliance and safety problem. Responsible monitoring is secure monitoring. Coverage requirements must address the reality that modern systems are heterogeneous and that blind spots often appear at the seams, especially in hybrid environments. Requirements should specify minimum monitoring coverage for each class of component, such as identity services, gateways, databases, administrative consoles, and critical workloads, and they should also specify that monitoring must extend across on-premises and cloud segments in a unified way. The architecture should define which systems are considered critical and must always report, and how to detect when reporting fails. Another important requirement is that monitoring must cover both management planes and data planes, because attackers often target management interfaces to gain broad control. Beginners may focus on application logs and forget about infrastructure control events like firewall rule changes, account creation, or key policy updates, but those are often the earliest indicators of compromise. Coverage requirements should also account for third-party services and dependencies, requiring visibility into access and configuration changes where possible. If a provider or partner cannot provide adequate evidence, that gap should be documented and mitigated through boundaries and compensating controls. A comprehensive coverage requirement is not a promise to monitor everything, but a promise to avoid unacceptable blind spots in high-risk areas. Operational resilience requirements for monitoring ensure that the monitoring capability itself does not become a single point of failure or a fragile dependency. Requirements should state that monitoring pipelines must be reliable and that failures in collection or forwarding are detectable and alerting, because silent loss of telemetry creates dangerous gaps. They should also specify capacity expectations so the system can handle spikes in log volume during incidents, since incidents often generate unusual levels of activity. Another key requirement is secure storage and backup for monitoring data, because logs are evidence, and losing them can prevent accurate scoping and recovery. Monitoring systems should also be designed to degrade gracefully, meaning that if a centralized system is temporarily unavailable, critical components should buffer essential logs and forward them when possible, rather than dropping them silently. Beginners often think of monitoring as a passive observer, but in reality, monitoring is an operational system with its own availability and integrity needs. Requirements should therefore include patching and hardening expectations for monitoring infrastructure, because if attackers compromise the monitoring platform, they can blind the defenders. Resilient monitoring is a defensive control, and defensive controls must be defended. When you specify resilience requirements, you ensure monitoring remains trustworthy during the moments it is needed most. When you specify infrastructure and system monitoring requirements well, you create a blueprint for detection and response that is grounded in observable behavior, protected evidence, and actionable alerts. You define what must be seen at trust boundaries, how identity and privilege changes must be recorded, and how network, host, and application signals must be captured with context. You require integrity, retention, and time synchronization so evidence is reliable, and you require centralization and correlation so the evidence can be used under pressure. You define alerting in a way that avoids both overload and silence, and you ensure that monitoring supports response tasks like scoping, containment, and timeline reconstruction. You also include privacy and access controls so the monitoring system does not become a new data exposure risk, and you require coverage and resilience so blind spots and telemetry loss are treated as serious failures. For beginners, The most important takeaway is that monitoring is not an optional add-on, but a core part of what makes an architecture defensible, because it provides the proof that controls are working and the early warning that controls are being tested. When monitoring requirements are clear and testable, detection becomes a capability you can count on, and response becomes a disciplined process rather than a panic-driven guess.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.